Hello everyone. So when it comes to the prospect of adapting the Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien into a movie, the prevailing consensus among Tolkien fans seems to be that this is something that is utterly impossible and should never be attempted under any circumstances. And I partly agree. The thing is, I think there are two sub-arguments nested within this big argument. On the one hand, you could say that it is impossible that within the current Hollywood system, a good movie based on the Silmarillion could ever be made. And I mostly agree with that statement, because let's be honest, it's a miracle that the original Lord of the Rings movies ever got made. Like, the more I learn about the production process of those movies, the more I realize that was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of event. And so, as a result, if J.R.R. Tolkien's estate ever did decide to sell the rights to the Silmarillion to a major movie studio, which is within the realm of possibility now because the main person guarding those rights for many years was Christopher Tolkien, and sadly now he is dead, so it's anyone's guess now if the estate's policy of not selling the rights to the property will continue into the future. If that ever did happen, what we would probably get is a movie that is designed as a prequel to The Lord of the Rings. In other words, the studios will be trying as hard as possible to make a movie that is like The Lord of the Rings as much as possible. They would try to twist and bend the story of the Silmarillion into something they know audiences will already like, The Lord of the Rings. Incidentally, I feel like this is sort of the fate that befell the Hobbit movies. The studios felt like they needed to make The Hobbit as much like Lord of the Rings as possible, and in the process, they ironically lost sight of both what made The Hobbit a great book and what made The Lord of the Rings great movies. Regardless, the reason I don't think this would work for the Silmarillion is that the Silmarillion is a fundamentally completely different type of story from The Lord of the Rings. You don't have any hobbits, you don't have any Shire, the time span over which the story takes place is much larger. It would just be a lot more difficult to make something that is manageable as a series of movies. In fact, we see this now with Amazon's Rings of Power show, which seems to be compressing hundreds of years worth of events into a much shorter time span in order to form a coherent narrative that can be told over a very small number of seasons. I can't really blame them for doing that, but I think it's inevitable that in the process of trying to make the story of the Second Age of Middle-earth more like a normal television show, they kind of lose sight of a lot of what made the Akallabeth and the stories of Numenor special in the first place. However, as I said earlier, I think there are two sub-arguments nested within the argument that it is impossible to make a good movie based on the Silmarillion. And the other part of that argument is that even if you had a visionary director with a master plan to adapt this novel into a series of movies with an unlimited budget and no studio interference whatsoever, even if we had that, it would still be impossible to make a good movie based on the Silmarillion. This is the part of the claim I would disagree with. The argument goes that the Silmarillion is not like a normal novel. It reads much more like a book of history and mythology, rather than something like Lord of the Rings. And that's true, but there are plenty of good movies based on mythology and history. There are good movies based on the Arthurian mythos. There are good movies based on, the Bible, a book that had a lot of influence on the Silmarillion. And do I even need to get into the many, many great movies that have been based on real historical events? My point is, there is no reason that the events of this book are fundamentally unadaptable. Like any good movie, I think for a movie based on the Silmarillion to be successful, you would have to really hone in on the humanity of the main characters and their character arcs and their emotional journeys, and really focus on that as opposed to the other stuff going on, the big spectacle. Now, of course, there is a lot of spectacle in the Silmarillion, and some of it would make great cinema, but there are also some things that are described in this book that would be fundamentally unshowable. I don't think it's the majority of things. I think it's just some aspects of the story that would need to be alluded to rather than portrayed on screen. For example, the early chapters in the Silmarillion are all about how the Valar, these majestic angelic beings, came down to Arda and shaped the landscape from scratch through these massive wars that raised up mountains and flooded valleys and created coastlines, and it's all very dramatic and big. But there's no way you could really show that without showing a bunch of CGI monsters battling it out in the sky, and that would get really boring very quickly. But the thing is, I don't think the presence of those scenes in the book makes this entire book unadaptable, because when I think of the Silmarillion, those are not the scenes that stand out to me. The scenes that stand out to me are the human scenes. The scenes of lonely characters wandering over broken landscapes mourning a lost home, or clutching their dying loved ones in their arms as they cry out in despair against a heartless world. These are the scenes that are the true heart of this book, and they beg to be portrayed cinematically. As proof of this, I offer the many, 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 many pieces of incredible visual art based off of this book. I have one of them right here on my wall, in fact, The Fall of Gondolin by John Howe. Look how cool this is. Can you imagine seeing this on a big screen? That would be awesome. I think of these pieces of art as proofs of concept that the events of the Silmarillion are not fundamentally unimaginable. They have been imagined many, many times, and the fact that they have been imagined in a visual format does not decrease their splendor and majesty and mystery. In fact, they only enhance it. Cinema has always taken a lot of inspiration from paintings and visual art, and the amount of visual art that has been made based off of this book alone, I think, proves that we crave to see a cinematic interpretation of these events. Okay, but those of you who have actually read the Silmarillion are probably thinking to yourselves now, how on earth would you even adapt such an unwieldy and complex narrative into the form of a series of movies? I'm not saying it would be easy, but what I'm going to be doing in the rest of this video is presenting my rough outline of how it could be done, a proof of concept, if you will. I have spent an unreasonable amount of time thinking about this because there are so many parts of this book that have just captured my imagination for so many years, and I constantly imagine myself sitting in a theater watching these events unfold on a big silver screen. I am a sucker for movie theaters and cinema, okay? I can't help it. So what I have outlined is a series of 12 to 14 movies. Now, I know that sounds insane, but bear with me here. Since we're already in the realm of the infeasible, we might as well just go all the way into pure fantasy. Obviously, 12 to 14 Silmarillion movies are never going to happen, but I like to think that they will. And more so, I like to think that they will be done well by a visionary director who is really, really passionate about the source material and is willing to dedicate like 20 years of their life to bringing this to screen. That's not going to happen, okay? Like I said, we're in the realm of pure fantasy. Alternatively, it's not impossible that this could be done by multiple directors because the way I've broken it up calls for several self-contained trilogies and duologies within this greater story, as you'll see. I don't know, that could work too. Now, I know 12 to 14 movies seems like way too many for a 300-page book, but for one thing, the events of this novel take place over the course of hundreds of years. There's no way you could do it in 1 or 2 movies. And second of all, ideally, a series of movies based on this book would not just be based on the Silmarillion, but also the many, many other peripheral books that fill in some of the blanks that the Silmarillion left. Christopher Tolkien spent his life publishing every spare scrap that J.R.R. Tolkien ever wrote on any piece of paper about Middle-earth, and so we have a whole lot of information that could theoretically make its way into these movies. Just to show you what I mean, this is a box set of the so-called Great Tales, the story of Beren and Lúthien, the children of Húrin, and the fall of Gondolin. Each of these books gets one chapter devoted to it in the Silmarillion, so you can imagine that the books flesh out a whole lot of information that is left absent in that book. And I don't even think that you could take one of these books, like the Children of Húrin, and do just one movie based off of that. If you've read that book, you probably know why, but this story alone, the Children of Húrin, is an absolutely massive story that spans decades, and yet it gets one chapter devoted to it in the Silmarillion. That should tell you how dense the Silmarillion is. I mean, come on, we're apparently getting 2 entire movies based on the hunt for Gollum. If it is an inevitability that, like the Dwarves of Moria, we are going to continue greedily mining the intellectual property of J.R.R. Tolkien until the day the sun burns out, we might as well make good movies, right? Instead of just endless prequels and slop. Now, you might say if the book is this dense and if there's this much ground to cover, why not do a TV show? The reason is because I like movies more. That's it. The real reason is that fantasy TV tends to focus more on things like politicking and scheming and big plots that interweave between multiple storylines and episodes. And while the Silmarillion has all of that stuff, I don't really think that's the focus of the story. I think the scenes that stand out the most to me from this book are these big, majestic moments that really can't be captured in a television format. I mean, let's be honest, even an expensive show like The Rings of Power doesn't look anywhere nearly as good as the Lord of the Rings movies. So, I don't know. I think cinema just has a special sauce. That's why I'm pro cinema. What am I even saying? Okay, so before I get into my headcanon outline for this movie series, I feel like I should talk a little bit more about some of the other reasons why people say the Silmarillion can never make a good movie. One of those reasons, as I mentioned earlier, is that there are no hobbits. Because let's be honest, the hobbits are one of the main reasons why the Lord of the Rings as a story is so universal and so successful. The hobbits are the audience stand-ins, right? The Shire is a world that is very much similar to our own, and the story of Lord of the Rings is almost like a portal fantasy, really. Like, the Shire is so different from everything else in Middle-earth that it feels like when they left the Shire, it's almost like they stepped through a portal into a completely different genre. The Rings of Power show even added in the Harfoots, presumably to address this very concern. So, of course, that's all well and good, and I agree that the hobbits are a huge part of why Lord of the Rings is so popular and successful, but I really don't think the characters in the Silmarillion are so alien or unrelatable as people sometimes make them out to be. I think there is something so deeply human about so many of them. A character like Húrin would be so interesting to explore, this anger-prone man who is constantly trying to do his best, but consistently falls victim to his own hubris. Or a character like Fëanor, who creates something so incredibly beautiful, yet falls victim to his own success in creating it, and ends his story holding back despair only by wrapping himself in comforting lies. Or a character like Aredhel, who desperately wants to escape the expectations of her society, but constantly finds herself in a worse situation as a result. These characters are relatable and poignant, and yes, they're not hobbits. They're not silly and funny like hobbits are, but that's why I'm saying the Silmarillion can't be like Lord of the Rings. It can't be a Lord of the Rings prequel. It can't be trying to do the things that Lord of the Rings does. And yes, it probably would be less commercially successful than Lord of the Rings if you're centering a story around these characters as opposed to hobbits. But I still think there is something so fundamentally deeply human here, and that there is an audience for these types of stories. Now, of course, if you're doing an adaptation of the Silmarillion, the hardest characters to adapt are probably going to be the Valar, the angelic beings that sang the worlds into existence and shaped Arda from scratch. And this is especially true because the Valar are actually really not in the story very much. You have to include them somehow, and they play a critical role, especially in the ending, which I'll get into that later, but the ending of the Silmarillion I think is by far the hardest part to adapt into a cinematic format. Yet despite this, they're barely in the book at all, even though they are one of my favorite parts of the book. I think you can't get away with not showing the Valar in a Silmarillion movie. I think you have to show them somehow, but you have to show them sparingly. And I think when you do show them, you should make them seem sort of human. The way that gods are portrayed in Greek tragedies, for example, could serve as a guide. They'll look human and they'll act human, and maybe every once in a while you'll get a glimpse of their true power. But you have to keep things constrained a little bit, because as I was saying earlier, a movie with a bunch of CGI giants roaming around a landscape is going to get really boring really quickly. This is also why I think an adaptation of the Silmarillion couldn't start from the very beginning. The very beginning of the Silmarillion is the Ainulin Dale, where the Ainur sing the world into existence. And then the early chapters are describing how the Valar came to Arda, how they built these giant towers that they set lights on, and how those towers were eventually destroyed by Melkor, and then how some battles with Melkor ended up shaping the landscape of Middle-earth and Arda. I think some of this stuff is better off just not being shown. And my reasoning there is that one of the things that makes the world building in Lord of the Rings so effective is this sense of deep time, this sense that the characters are wandering through landscapes that are rich with history, with ruined cities and towers, where every hill has a name. And if you're telling a story that starts literally at the dawn of time, you're not going to get that same sense of history that is so important to the atmosphere of all of Tolkien's works. I think this is one of the reasons why the early chapters of the Silmarillion are so incredibly vague. So then, of course, the inevitable question is, where do you start the story? I think the best place to start would be the awakening of the elves at Cuevanian, and I'll get into that later. But the point is, this is already several chapters into the Silmarillion, and I think this is where the story really starts, because the Silmarillion is the story about the elves, right? It's a story about how the elves, the first children of Ilúvatar, were destined for greatness and glory, and ended up achieving a fraction of that, but also ended up destroying the entire world in the process. To me, this is the logical place to start. However, I also think it would make sense not to have that be the first movie ever made in the Silmarillion sequence. The most logical way to tell the story, I think, would not be chronologically, but to start in the middle with one of the great tales, specifically Beren and Lúthien, and then to jump back to the older stories before jumping forward to the end. That may seem strange, but I have my reasoning. For one thing, the great tales were actually my introduction to the story of the Silmarillion. I read the story of the children of Húrin before ever reading the Silmarillion, and yes, there is some context that I didn't understand, but overall I found it very well suited as a self-contained story. It's manageable, it fits within the broader lore, but it's a complete story in its own right, with its own unique cast of characters and satisfying narrative arcs. Satisfying is maybe the wrong word to use here. It's complete on its own, is what I mean. Starting with the tales of Beren and Lúthien and the children of Húrin could serve as a way of sort of testing the waters of the Silmarillion, making a movie or series of movies that could exist on its own before leaping all the way into doing something based on the entire Silmarillion. Because if you do that first movie starting at the very beginning of the story, you're basically committing yourself to doing a whole lot. And what if nobody likes the movie, you know? What if it's a total flop? I said that financial considerations were out the window here, so maybe I should just ignore that, whatever. For what it's worth, I do think that the story of Beren and Lúthien would be a great place to start, because it is the most similar to Lord of the Rings, probably, out of all the stories in the Silmarillion, in that it involves an epic quest to seize a stolen jewel embarked upon by individuals who are very relatable to the audience. At least Beren is definitely supposed to be an audience stand-in. I mean, he was partly inspired by Tolkien. Anyway, that's what's going to happen in the rest of this video. I'm going to be describing every single movie in this sequence of headcanon movies I have dreamed up in my imagination by spending way too many hours thinking about this. And rather than trying to cover everything, I'm going to focus my summary on a series of key images that I think highlight why these movies deserve to be made. But before we get into all that, I've talked about how artistic interpretations of the Silmarillion have inspired me to think that making a movie based on this book is not impossible. However, I have zero artistic skill myself, even though I've always wanted to learn how to draw. Fortunately, I've been given a new opportunity to learn how to draw thanks to a course offered by today's sponsor, Skillshare. Look, there are many skills that I want to learn, not only visual art, but also music making, film production, photography. If there's a cool hobby anywhere out there, chances are I've wanted to take it up from time to time in my life. Skillshare is a fantastic service for people like me who always want to take up new hobbies. It is a massive online learning community offering both artistic and practical skills in almost every field imaginable, from film to art to writing to music. Since I've been wanting to learn how to draw, I've been checking out an aptly named course called How to Draw, a Beginner's Guide, which is great because I'm a beginner. This course offers 6 hours of content leading you through the steps of learning how to draw from scratch, and Skillshare also allows you to upload your projects that you make while following along with the course and review the projects that other people taking the class make. I truly think that there is something that will be of interest to anyone on Skillshare, so if that at all sounds interesting to you, be sure to check out the link in my description because the first 500 people to click it will get 1 month of Skillshare absolutely free. So thank you again to Skillshare for sponsoring, and now back to my rambling. One thing I want to note before I get started here. I am not a Tolkien expert or a Tolkien scholar. There's going to be stuff I get wrong, there's going to be stuff I miss, and I'm probably going to pronounce a bunch of names incorrectly. If you are a native speaker of an Elvish language, I'm terribly sorry. Okay, so Beren and Lúthien. I bet you were wondering why I was standing in front of a blank door this whole time. Well, now you know. It's my whiteboard. As I was saying, I think the story of Beren and Lúthien is a great place to start telling the story of the Silmarillion because it's one of the great tales, it's a self-contained story, and it's also a romance. And you know, everyone loves romance, right? The two characters might even be familiar to hardcore fans of the Lord of the Rings movies because they're mentioned by Aragorn in the Fellowship of the Ring. Basically, this is the story of two star-crossed lovers, Beren, a mortal man, and Lúthien, an elf, who have to go on a quest to steal one of the Silmarils, the 3 magical jewels that the whole conflict of this book is about, from Melkor. And on the way, they get sidetracked with a whole lot of shenanigans. Now, you can maybe tell the story in one movie, but like, come on, The Hunt for Gollum is getting 2 movies apparently. We can do 2 movies for Beren and Lúthien, right? I think there is also a very logical place to divide the story here. The first part of the narrative can go from the beginning of the story all the way up until the point where Lúthien rescues Beren from his captivity by Sauron. And then the second part of the story covers everything from their journey to Angband to steal the Silmarils from Melkor all the way until the end. I think this makes sense because the battle in Tol in Gaurhoth serves as a nice climax to the first movie. I also really like a good duology. I think it's an underrated format. So in the first Beren and Lúthien movie, what I'm picturing is a movie that is sort of itself divided into 2 halves. The first part of the movie is all about Beren and Lúthien falling in love. Basically, Beren encounters Lúthien in the forests of Doriath. He sees her dancing, and they spend some time together in the forest. We don't get a whole lot of details about this time, but I think it would be really cool in a movie to flesh this out and maybe expand a little bit on the process of them falling in love and make it slower. In the book, it is said that they fall in love immediately, and Tolkien really does enjoy his love at first sight trope. But I think it would be really cool to have this extended sequence where Beren, who is on the run after his father and the band of outlaws that he was with were all killed, stumbles upon Lúthien in the forest, and then having multiple scenes where they encounter each other again and again, and maybe Lúthien starts to care for him a little bit because she can see that he's lost and suffering. And then almost before they realize what happens, they fall in love. You know, it could be really nice. The first half of the movie can also set up some of the central conflict in the story, where we can have scenes of Melian, Thingol, and Galadriel discussing the coming of the Noldor into Beleriand, the siege of Angband recently being broken, Melkor sitting up there in Thangorodrim with the Silmarils. You know, a brief summary of things that have happened so far. But then in the second half of the movie, things take a much darker turn. Beren goes and gets captured by Sauron, and Lúthien tries to rescue him, but she ends up getting captured in Nargothrond, and then eventually she escapes and goes and rescues him. I really love the idea of a slow build-up here, where the first half of the movie is tonally very different from the second half. One of the major difficulties, though, in a Beren and Lúthien movie is the problem of how to show Lúthien's powers. Lúthien has a lot of powers in the Silmarillion because she's essentially a demigod. She's the daughter of Melian, who is a Maya, who is one of the powerful angelic beings who sang the world into existence. But her powers are very vaguely defined. She can shapeshift, she can cast spells on people, she can destroy stuff. It's not really clear what the limitations on her powers are because that's not really the kind of magic system that Tolkien is interested in exploring. I think you could find an effective way to navigate this. Like, Gandalf is on a similar power level in The Lord of the Rings, and his presence in the story doesn't completely break the story. He does does powerful stuff sometimes, but you kind of get a sense of what his limitations are, when he is too weary to continue fighting, etc., etc. Lúthien's powers, interestingly, seem to revolve around dance. Whenever she starts to do something magical, she's always dancing. And I think the image of Lúthien dancing, especially the image of her dancing in the forest when Beren first finds her, is one of the core images that would be so interesting to adapt. Because we really don't know what Lúthien's dancing looks like. Can you imagine how cool it would be to design and choreograph a whole dance that fits within the universe of the story, but also showcases her own sort of unique power? Something that is strong and forceful, but also majestic and graceful. You could do a lot of really interesting visual stuff with Lúthien's dancing. The other key lynch points in mind I have for this movie is one scene where Lúthien is escaping Nargothrond riding on Húrin, the talking dog of Valinor. And I'm just imagining Húrin running over the landscape with epic music playing while Lúthien is on her way to Tol Galroth. And then finally the movie would end when Beren and Lúthien return briefly to the forest. In the book, what happens is Beren tries to leave Lúthien there and go on his own to Angband, but Lúthien follows after him just as she tried to do before. I think it would also be interesting to swap this around, since Beren would be so weakened and tired after his experience of captivity by Sauron. Maybe Lúthien tries to leave him behind and go to Angband herself, and then Beren chases after her, you know, as like a parallel to what happened earlier. Regardless, the image of the two of them finally setting off for Angband parallels the image of Frodo and Sam at the end of Fellowship of the Ring on their way to Mount Doom. It could just be a really powerful way to end the movie. And then in the second movie, we start off with the journey to Angband and everything that takes place there. Beren and Lúthien disguise themselves as a wolf and a vampire, respectively. Yes, there are vampires in this book. Usually in art, the vampire that Lúthien is disguising herself as, Turingwethel, is just portrayed as a giant bat. They make it to Angband. Lúthien casts a spell on Morgoth that puts him to sleep, and then they steal the Silmaril, run outside. Beren gets his hand bitten off by Carcharoth, the dog guarding the entrance, who is just waking up. Carcharoth eats the Silmaril, and then they wander around the landscape for a while until they eventually get picked up by eagles while they're on the verge of death. And then there's a whole separate part of the story that takes place back when they're in Doriath. Basically, Carcharoth is driven mad by the Silmaril that he consumed, and eventually confronts Beren again. Beren manages to kill Carcharoth, but in the process, he himself dies. Then Lúthien herself dies, goes to the halls of Mandos in order to plead for Beren to be brought back to life, and then succeeds. There are so many cool images in this whole sequence of events. I love to imagine Beren and Lúthien walking into the valley of Thangorodrim with these massive volcanic mountains towering around them, perhaps even with prisoners dangling by one hand off the side of the cliff like Maedhros was. And then this whole sequence where they're infiltrating Angband could be so suspenseful. Lúthien casts a spell that puts everyone in the fortress to sleep, and what I'm imagining is that as they're trying to escape, the orcs and other creatures scattered about the floor are slowly starting to wake up and realize what's going on, and they have to get out of there as quickly as possible before they wake all the way up. Meanwhile, Lúthien is exhausted from casting that spell and can barely walk, so Beren almost has to carry her. It could be really tense. And then, of course, we get that final epic scene where Lúthien is singing before Mandos, begging for Beren to be brought back to life. The music in the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies is easily one of the best parts of those movies, and it could be so cool to compose and write a song that is so moving that it convinces the Lord of the Dead to bring a woman's dead lover back to life. There are people who have attempted to write this song, and some of the results are breathtaking. And then I like the idea of cutting away after that scene to show Beren and Lúthien living their happy life now with their son Dior, and, you know, just chilling, living their second attempt at life, finally getting to rest after everything they've been through. Yeah, that's a wrap on Beren and Lúthien. Okay, now let's say you do Beren and Lúthien, and oh boy, it's a smash hit. Everyone wants more Silmarillion movies. What do you do now? Well, you could go back to the beginning if you wanted to, or you could continue telling the great tales. If you continue with the great tales, then the next one to do is The Children of Húrin. The Children of Húrin, I imagine, as being a trilogy of movies. Now, I know, put down your pitchforks. I know you're going to say it's crazy to make a trilogy of movies based off of one book. But listen, they made 3 Hobbit movies, okay? 3 Hobbit movies off of one children's book. Let me have this. The Children of Húrin is a really long and expansive story that covers, like, I don't know, 30 years maybe. It tells the story of a guy named Húrin who learns the location of the secret elven city of Gondolin. Then he gets captured by Morgoth, and Morgoth attempts to torture him to get the location of the city out of him, but Húrin continues to hold, and so Morgoth is really mad about this and instead decides to torture his children. His children, Túrin and Nienor, have a whole lot of horrible stuff happen to them, and eventually Nienor loses her memory. Túrin doesn't recognize her for who she is and ends up marrying her, and it's like a Greek tragedy. It's horrible. The Children of Húrin is by far the darkest tale in the Silmarillion, and I think it could be really cool to tell the story that goes from a place of relative hope at the beginning all the way to this just very dark and grim tragedy at the end. So how would I split this up? The first movie would cover the childhood of Húrin, basically everything from when Húrin first learns about Gondolin up until the time when Húrin, after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the Nirnaoth Arnodiad, where Húrin is captured, has to go and flee to Doriath and live there for a little while. I think that seems like a logical breaking point because after that there's a long time gap in the narrative where Húrin grows up in Doriath. It would be a very interesting movie because on the one hand you have the story of Húrin, which is a very slow, sad story that sets him up for his tragic character arc later on. His first sister Lalaith dies when she's only 2 years old. Húrin goes off to war and gets captured, and then after this disastrous battle, the orc armies start coming closer and he has to leave his mother and flee with 2 servants into the wilderness, into the unknown. But then on the other hand, you have the story of the battle itself, which this battle, the Nirnaoth Arnodiad, is kind of insane. The giant dragon Glaurung is involved, who plays a pivotal role in this story in the future. Anyway, the reason I would be really excited to see this movie is because I really like these scenes where Húrin is a kid, especially his relationship with the old man Saedor. There are so many scenes that stand out to me here. The scene where Húrin first finds out that his sister Lalaith has died. The scene where he turns back one last time to say farewell to his mother as he's leaving behind a hill into the unknown. And then there's also this amazing sequence where after he arrives in Doriath, Húrin befriends an elf child named Nelas who comforts him in this time where he's just incredibly lost and destitute. Anyway, the second movie starts when Húrin is an adult in Doriath, and there's a whole lot of stuff that goes down in this movie, but eventually the movie ends with the fall of Nargothrond, which is one of the critical elven strongholds. Basically, at this point in the story, Húrin is starting off in a fairly good place. Like, he still misses his family, but he's really built a name for himself in Doriath. He wears the Helm of Hador, and he's renowned for his great deeds and his ability to chop up orcs and everything. But then slowly, as the narrative goes on, the curse of Morgoth lays more heavily on him. Just disaster after disaster befalls him. Sometimes his own pride gets in the way. Sometimes he really just makes innocent mistakes with devastating consequences. One of the key moments in this part of the story is the scene where he kills his friend Beleg. He's captured by orcs and Beleg comes to rescue him, and he kills Beleg thinking that Beleg is an orc. And yeah, it's horrible. It's really just, it's a downer. So this movie would be a kind of depressing decline from this place of relative optimism to a place of despair as finally Nargothrond falls. And then we get to part 3, which is the real kicker, the part where everything just really goes bad. At this point, Nienor and Morwen, Húrin's sister and mother, make their way down from their home in Dor-lomin to Doriath in order to try to find him, and they eventually come across Nargothrond and the dragon Glaurung sitting in the ruins of the city. Nienor looks Glaurung directly in the eyes and loses all memory of who she is. She runs away into the forest and eventually is rescued by Húrin, who has no idea who she is because he hasn't seen her in ages. And then the two of them end up getting married. Glaurung comes, Húrin kills Glaurung, and then Glaurung, with his dying words, tells them the truth of their identity, and the two of them kill themselves. Really sad. This movie would have much fewer big battles than the previous 2 movies in this series. It would be a much more contained narrative. I imagine it feeling almost like a horror movie with the way things just keep going wrong and this creeping sense of dread. The way Glaurung is kind of prowling around Húrin's home in Brethil like this kind of oncoming bad omen. And then the scenes where Nienor loses her memory could be so scary. What's interesting is that in original drafts of this story, Nienor simply lost her memory of who she was and where she came from, but she still had all her faculties with her. Whereas in the final published version of the story, Nienor completely forgot even how to speak and do basic human activities. She has the mind of a child almost, which makes the whole thing just so much creepier and horrible. Glaurung is a really just hateable and interesting villain. And then you have some scenes where Húrin seems to have a few last moments of glory before everything goes wrong, when he's raising his sword into the air and it seems like fire is leaping off the end of it, and when he finally kills Glaurung. And of course these scenes are saturated with irony because the audience knows the truth of what's really going to happen. Nienor, just before killing herself, looks at the body of her brother and says, "Farewell, twice beloved," and then leaps into the roaring stream, never to be seen again. I'm just imagining this really sad, quiet moment where she steps off the cliff face with anguish in her face and lets herself be dashed on the rocks below. Like I said, The Children of Húrin was my introduction to the world of the Silmarillion. I think it's a really great self-contained story, and I think it would be so different from The Lord of the Rings that mainstream audiences would be really interested in seeing this other darker side of Tolkien's legendarium. So now we're really getting into some tricky territory because we can't go too much farther in the story without laying out some of the context behind the Noldor and the destruction of the trees and everything. But there is one other story that is sort of a crossover between the story of the Children of Húrin and the story of Beren and Lúthien that you could do next if you wanted to, or you could push it back later. I don't know. I leave it up to you to decide. This is the story of The Ruin of Doriath. I tried to think if there's a way to include this story in one of the other movies in this series, but I don't think there is. It's heavily interconnected with everything else, but there are a lot of events that go down in this chapter of the Silmarillion, and so it kind of needs its own movie. I'm picturing just one movie for this chapter. I know at this point you're probably like, why don't we just make every chapter 7 movies, right? The reason this story is a crossover is because it heavily features both Húrin and Beren and Lúthien coming out of the events of their respective series. Húrin is finally released from captivity by Melkor after Melkor realizes there's nothing he can do to get this man to tell him where Gondolin is, and he goes to Nargothrond and gets this really pretty piece of jewelry called the Nauglamir that he presents to Thingol, the king of Doriath, in exchange for Thingol's help in bringing up his son Túrin, who is now dead at this point. Thingol still has a hold of the Silmaril that Beren and Lúthien got him, and so he decides, why don't I take the Silmaril and the Nauglamir and kind of stick them together. And so he does that. And this sets off a whole series of disastrous events. Basically, there's a whole lot of wars between the elves and the dwarves over who has the rights to the Silmaril. Beren and Lúthien get involved, and this is where they actually have the true ending of their story. They both die here. And then at the end, the sons of Fëanor just come and kill everyone in order to get the Silmaril back in an event known as the Second Kinslaying. And they don't even succeed in getting the Silmaril back, so the whole thing just kind of sucks. Now, the thing is, with the sons of Fëanor coming in at the end, it would kind of make sense to make this movie after you've done the background movies on the sons of Fëanor, so that you have some understanding of why they are so desperate to kill everyone just to get this shiny piece of jewelry. But it is also heavily connected to both of the other movie series that we've already done, so I don't know. This one, I'm not really sure where you would put it. There are also a lot of characters involved in this story. Unlike with the previous ones, there's no clear main character. I think Dior, the son of Beren and Lúthien, would have to be one of the emotional anchors of the story, because he's involved in a lot of these events. And the story of Melian and Thingol is also very tragic here. Thingol dies, and Melian loses her will to live after that, eventually letting fall the girdle of Melian that protected Doriath from invading armies, which has huge repercussions. Melian just has a very lonely and depressing ending to her story. The Silmarillion is a really depressing book. Have I mentioned that? One of the key scenes that stands out to me here is the scene where Beren finally lays eyes on the Silmaril again that he wrested from the crown of Morgoth so many years ago. Beren in this story is almost like a legacy character getting called back in for one last mission and eventually meeting his demise. So this movie covers all of those events up until the Second Kinslaying, when the sons of Fëanor try and fail to get the Silmaril. Now we finally do actually have to go back to the beginning, because we really need some context for all of this stuff. So for the beginning of the narrative of the Silmarillion, I have imagined another duology that I'm calling Fëanor and Co. Title is a work in progress. This is gonna cover the big stuff, guys. Like, this is what the plot of the whole Silmarillion is about. What I'm picturing is a first movie that goes all the way from the awakening of the elves at Cuavianen all the way until the first kinslaying at Alcolonde. And then we get a second movie that covers everything from the crossing of the Noldor over the Helcraxe, the grinding ice, all the way up until the Siege of Angband and the beginning of the Long Peace. Both of these movies cover massive spans of time, so you would probably have to break each of the movies up into like individual chapters. I think you could make it work, but it would be very different from all the other movies we've talked about so far. The first movie in particular, which you might call The Oath of Fëanor, if you wanted to, would cover like hundreds of years, which is crazy. So as I said earlier, the Silmarillion is like a story about the elves, fundamentally. So I think in these movies, even though the Valar play a larger role in this part of the story than they do later on, I think the story should still focus very much on the elves, and especially Fëanor and the sons of Fëanor, and the whole Finwë family. This is where we get some of the really big themes of the Silmarillion, especially this theme of decline. At the point where this story would begin, with the awakening of the elves at Cuavianen, there is already a lot of history, a lot of stuff that has gone down, especially the destruction of these giant lamps in the sky, the light of which now powers the 2 trees of Valinor. But overall, we do eventually reach a very stable, happy place. The elves, at first, when they awaken, are very confused and afraid, because Melkor is the first person to make contact with them. He even takes some of the elves and drags them down to the pits of Utumno and makes the first orcs. At least that's what some of the legends say. But then eventually Orome, one of the Valar, finds them and brings them to Valinor, and then we reach this place of certainty and light and hopefulness. And then all of that is destroyed after the destruction of the trees and Fëanor swearing the oath and eventually killing the Teleri. It's a massive, massive narrative. Like, this would be one of the longest movies, probably. But there are just so many images here that just really stand out to me and that I really want to see portrayed. For example, the awakening of the elves. I think since this would be the earliest movie in the series chronologically, it would be cool to do like a musical overture at the beginning of the movie that sort of represents the music of the Ainur without any visuals, just like a black screen and music playing that starts out harmonious and eventually gets more and more discordant and kind of tells the story of the entire Silmarillion in a piece of music. And then eventually this music that is getting chaotic and discordant and horrifying fades away as we take the perspective of the elves looking up at the stars as they're coming out of the water for the first time. It could be breathtakingly beautiful if you did it right. If you wanted to, you could even do a visual parallel between the beginning and end of the movie, where at the end of the movie, the bodies of the Teleri are being dumped into the harbor after they've been killed, which parallels them coming out of the water at the beginning of the movie. I don't know, that could be cool. And then there are some scenes where the Valar are battling Melkor and eventually imprisoning him. All of this stuff would be very hard to show, but I think if you take the perspective of the elves, you could do it in a subtle and effective way, where the elves are kind of huddled in caves. I think in the book it even says the Valar placed some kind of protective spell around them while they were waging this war that is reshaping the entire landscape of Middle-earth. They see and hear all this stuff going on in the sky, and they see fire burning in the distance, but they don't know what's going on. And then eventually the Valar come to them and like, yeah, Morgoth is captured now. The cool thing about some of these early movies is that it all takes place at night because there's no sun and no moon yet, so it's just starlight, and that would be such an interesting visual to see all this stuff happening in starlight. So yeah, Melkor destroys the 2 trees of Valinor with the help of the giant spider lady Ungoliant, and then Fëanor and Co swear the Oath of Fëanor, where they promise to kill anybody in possession of a Silmaril who does not give up that Silmaril to them willingly, and then eventually do a little bit of genocide on the Teleri. Fëanor's character arc would be the emotional core of this movie. His descent into pride and obsession with this work of his own hands that is objectively beautiful, but which has caused so much harm and destruction. Then in the second movie, in the Fëanor and Co duology, which you might call the return of the Noldor, maybe, we get the Noldor returning back to Beleriand after so many years of being absent and starting the siege of Angband, and there's a whole lot of battles that go down here that are very vaguely described in the Silmarillion, so a lot of room to make stuff up and expand. This is a really critical part of the story because this is where the Noldor kind of achieve their legendary status as the protectors of Beleriand against the wrath of Melkor. And their initial optimism and glory and grandeur upon finally crossing the ice and reaching Beleriand slowly turns to despair as over time they realize that their quest is impossible. But because of their oath and because they're committed to their oath, they grit their teeth and continue to fight. There's something really deeply sad about the hopelessness of their situation and the way that they delude themselves into thinking that they can win this battle, that deep down they know they can't win. There's this beautiful passage where Fëanor is dying, and as he's dying, he's looking out into the distance at the peaks of Thangorodrim and realizing deep in his heart that he knows this is an impossible mission, but then telling his sons to keep fighting anyway. Yeah, it's really beautiful. And then in this part of the story, we also get one of my favorite scenes in the Silmarillion where Maedhros is captured and dangles from the top of Thangorodrim by one hand and is eventually rescued after like 4 years hanging up there. It's crazy. The problem with this movie, I think, more than any of the ones I've talked about so far, is that there are so many characters and so many storylines that I don't know what the core character arcs would be aside from Fëanor and maybe Maedhros. There's a whole lot that goes on here regarding the establishment of the great elven kingdoms all over Beleriand. Like, do we cover the foundation of Gondolin? Do we cover the meeting of Thingol and Melian in the forest where they like fall into a trance for however many years? There's a lot of different routes you could take with this. So after we finish with the Fëanor stuff, we have a bit of a lengthy time gap, like 200 years, until we get to the next major event in the Silmarillion. The ruins of Beleriand. This is a major confrontation that starts with a battle called the Battle of the Sudden Flame, or the Dagor Bragollach. I don't know if I said that correctly. Basically, the siege of Angband has been in a stalemate for a very long time, and now all of a sudden Morgoth decides to do a surprise attack and release a bunch of rivers of lava across Beleriand, and also sends Glaurung out there to wreak devastation on everything. Like with the previous episode in this series, this is a big event that spans multiple years and has a bunch of different storylines and characters that you could explore. I think 2 characters who could obviously be central to this story are Fingolfin and Barahir. Barahir is Beren's father, and this movie is sort of almost a direct prequel to Beren and Lúthien in that it explains how Beren and Barahir ended up in their band of outlaws roaming around, which is where we find Beren at the start of his story before all the outlaws die. And then we also have Fingolfin, who has the most epic scene in the entire Silmarillion in this chapter of the story, where he challenges Morgoth to single combat, and Morgoth comes and fights him, and Fingolfin actually manages to wound him pretty severely before Morgoth finally kills him. This scene right here is like the reason you want to make this movie, right? Like this is such a big climactic epic moment. So many pieces of art have been made based on this scene alone. Now I also think that if you wanted to be a little bit cheeky and mess around with the timelines a little bit. It's kind of sacrilegious, I know. But if you wanted to, you could bring in the character of Haleth and make her central to this conflict as well. Now, in lore, Haleth actually died several decades before the start of the Dagor Bragollach. But if you want to tell her story in a series of movies like this, which I think you should because she's a really cool character, you could theoretically push her back in the timeline a little bit and make it so that she is a player in this conflict as well. Haleth is the founder of the House of Haleth, which is one of the 3 great houses of men. They're a mostly reclusive people of warriors who, after Haleth kind of won them their freedom, sort of stick to their own area of the map and guard their borders zealously. This film could explore how this house is founded in the middle of this massive conflict that spans across the entire continent. Just a thought, I don't know, maybe that's a little bit sacrilegious. Speaking of sacrilegious, some of you hardcore Silmarillion fans out there may have noticed that I skipped over a pretty important part of the story, which is the story of Aredhel. Aredhel is a character that I really don't think you can leave out. Like, you have to have her be in the story somehow. Aredhel's story takes place between the start of the Long Peace and the Dagor Bragollach, and it ends up playing a pretty critical role in the story because her son Maeglin has a huge influence on events in the fall of Gondolin. So why did I skip it? Well, if you wanted to, you could just do a separate movie for Aredhel. The thing is, it would be a much smaller, shorter, self-contained story. Aredhel's story is actually one of the hidden gems, in my opinion, of the Silmarillion, so I don't want to skip over it completely. But, I was also thinking, what if there was a way to cover this story in the next major arc of the series, which is the fall of Gondolin. As I said, the story of Aredhel and her son Maeglin has a huge impact on the events of this story. Now, this story takes place hundreds of years after, I believe, and I don't really think you could push Aredhel's story to be simultaneous with the events of the fall of Gondolin without causing some huge timeline wonkiness problems. But maybe you could cover it in the form of flashbacks or something like that, or like a cold open sequence. I hate to do that to Aredhel, but we already have so many movies that, like, I don't know, maybe she should just get her own movie. Whatever. Anyway, the Fall of Gondolin is the 3rd of the great stories of Middle-earth, along with Beren and Lúthien and the Children of Húrin. And because it's so big and it has its own book devoted to it, I think it can be split into 2 parts. The story of the Fall of Gondolin revolves around Tuor, a cousin, I believe, of Húrin from the Children of Húrin, who makes his way to the hidden city of Gondolin that Húrin and Húr visited earlier on, falls in love with the princess of Gondolin, Aredhel, and then eventually survives the destruction of this city at the hands of the forces of Melkor. This is a really big dramatic sequence. I mean, I have a painting of it on my wall, so you can probably guess that I like it a lot. I think if you were going to do this in 2 movies, it would make sense to have the first movie be about Tuor's journey towards finding Gondolin and eventually living in the city and falling in love with Aredhel. And then the second part of the story could cover everything from the betrayal of Maeglin all the way up until the refugees escape Gondolin through the hidden mountain passes. Some of the critical scenes that stand out from the story are the scene where Ulmo confronts Tuor and tells him about Gondolin for the first time. This is a really cool moment because it's the first time in a while that one of the Valar has directly influenced events in Beleriand. A lot of the art that portrays this moment has Ulmo being this giant hulking guy standing in the ocean. And I think you could definitely do it like that. Even though I said earlier that I would prefer it a little bit if the Valar were a little bit more human-sized in stature, you could still have moments like this where they appear to people to be these massive, tall guys. And then in part 2, the whole sequence with the refugees escaping from Gondolin has just captured my imagination ever since I first read about it. This part of the story is just so incredible. It could be this long, drawn-out sequence of these refugees running away from the city for days on end, weakened and weary and mourning their lost home. And then at a critical moment, a giant Balrog of all things comes down and attacks them, and Glorfindel fights the Balrog, and it's like, it's epic. It's awesome. So we're getting close to the end now, guys, and we're also getting into the territory of things that I'm a little bit less sure about, because the next 2 movies that I have outlined here all take place over the course of 10 pages in the Silmarillion, and we don't really get a whole lot more information about these events than what we have in the Silmarillion. So make of that what you will. But the story needs to be wrapped up somehow, and the next place to go is the Voyage of Eärendil. Eärendil is the son of Tuor and Aredhel, so this directly comes off the fall of Gondolin. And Eärendil is the mariner who sails to Valinor and beseeches the Valar to come to the aid of Beleriand and fight back Melkor once and for all, which eventually happens. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes down. There's a 3rd kinslaying by the sons of Fëanor to complete the genocide trilogy that we began earlier. And Elwing, the wife of Eärendil, is seemingly killed in this event, but ends up becoming a bird, and then she joins him in Valinor. Obviously, the core of this part of the story has to revolve around Eärendil and Elwing, But I'll be honest with you, Eärendil is one of the characters that I didn't really connect with as much as some of the other characters in this book. I don't really know why. Probably because we only have like 5 pages about him. But he's so famous and important in the lore because his ship, Vengelot, goes on to become like the morning star and the evening star that characters in the Lord of the Rings talk about all the time. And him sailing to Valinor kind of wraps up the whole story of the Silmarillion. So you have to cover this somehow. We're getting into the territory of like, you're going to have to make up a lot of stuff in order to tell a satisfying and coherent narrative. But there is definitely like the core of a good story here. Now, the finale of the Silmarillion, the grand battle that everything has been leading up to, is the War of Wrath. The War of Wrath gets a total of like 2 pages devoted to it in the Silmarillion. You thought Peter Jackson was crazy for dragging out the Battle of the 5 Armies, which gets 5 pages in The Hobbit, into a 3-hour movie? Well, look at this. And the frustrating thing about the War of Wrath is that most of the main characters are not even really involved in it at all. In fact, Christopher Tolkien just straight up writes in the Silmarillion that very little is known of the War of Wrath because most people who were involved in it died afterwards. But this conflict is the conflict where the Valar finally come back to Beleriand and break the siege of Angband and chain up Melkor once again and cast him out of the Doors of Night into the void beyond this world, where he can never wreak havoc on the world again. The whole war apparently lasts something like 40 years, and yet we know next to nothing about it. And this is where we're getting into the territory of like, how do you do a movie based on these events that isn't just a big, boring CGI battle in the sky? One of the most memorable things that happens in this battle is that Eärendil and his flying ship Vengelot, yeah, the ship flies now, fights Ancalagon the Black, which is this giant dragon that's like the size of a mountain. That would be really epic to see in IMAX, I'm not gonna lie, but I'm struggling to even imagine like what it would even look like to see something like that happening. Part of what makes Tolkien's prose very effective in these passages is that he is so incredibly vague, and it feels like if you're going to portray something like that on screen, you're going to necessarily get bogged down with a lot of specificity of like, okay, how does this ship even fly? How is it fighting this giant dragon? And once you get bogged down with the specificity, a lot of the mythological impact of the passage is lost. This is where I see people having a point that maybe some parts of the Silmarillion are just kind of unadaptable, but because we've already done all of this, we've already adapted the easier parts, you know, we have to wrap up the story somehow, right? We have to do something. I guess that's a problem that can just be crossed when we get to it. Now, I will say that even though reading this passage in the book, it's hard for me to imagine what the emotional core of a movie about these events would be. Something that does stand out to me in that regard is the story of the 2 sons of Fëanor, Maedhros and Maglor. After the War of Wrath, these 2 brothers finally get their hands on the Silmarils that they've been seeking after for so long. In fact, they steal it from Olwe, I believe. And it's a big moment because the whole conflict of this entire book so far has been about trying to get these precious jewels, and now they finally lay their hands on them, and it burns their hands because of all their foul deeds. Apparently, the Silmaril just like burns them to the touch. And the 2 of them are so desperate to love these jewels that they fought after for so long that they carry them with them despite the pain for quite a while, until finally, in agony, one of them casts their jewel into the depths of the earth and the other one casts it into the depths of the sea, and the jewels are never seen again. This moment right here is the part of the story that I would most want to see. It's the reason why you have to conclude the story with the War of Wrath somehow. This is like the final poignant irony of the Silmarillion. The fact that so much has been lost in pursuit of these little gems. And now that the Sons of Fëanor finally have their hands on these gems, they don't even want them anymore because they realize how much they've lost in pursuit of them. It's beautiful. It's heartbreaking. It would be absolute cinema. Okay, so I need to wrap this up now. I hope this video didn't go on too long. I feel like it probably did. I should conclude by saying a few things. First of all, I have 0 qualifications to be coming up with a scheme like this for adapting the Silmarillion into a movie. I'm not a movie director, okay? I've just thought for so long about what I would want to see if I saw these books on screen that eventually I sat down and was like, okay, if you were going to do a series of movies based on this book, how would you do it? And this is what I came up with. But I would encourage you, implore you, in fact, to argue with me in the comments about all the things you think I've done wrong, because it boosts engagement on this video and because I want to know what you think. Some of the choices I made here are probably kind of obvious. Some of them are a lot more debatable, and I'm really curious to know what other people would think and how they would approach this, if they would approach it at all. And finally, I should reiterate that I don't advocate for the Tolkien estate actually selling the rights to the Silmarillion so that something like this can be made, because 9 times out of 10, if you sell the rights to the Silmarillion, you're just going to get some corporate studio slop. If you should take away anything from all this, is that adapting this book into a series of good movies would be really, really, really hard. Not impossible. This is my lukewarm defense of the idea that it is possible, technically, but it would be really hard. And unless some perfect visionary auteur comes along who is like, yes, I want to devote my entire life to making the Silmarillion into a series of movies, unless that happens, then I think the Tolkien estate is better off just hanging on to the rights. So we'll never get to see this, probably. But, you know, a guy can dream, right? I hope you guys enjoyed watching me ramble. I hope some of you are still here listening to this. And if you are, thank you so much. I love this book to an unhealthy degree, in case you haven't noticed, and I could talk about it for hours and hours and hours. So I hope, you know, I hope this was somewhat entertaining. Anyway, please do subscribe if you want to see more rambles from me and other types of content from me. And until next time, thank you so much, and bye. Thank you. Bye.